Ethan Rivers had never seen the 42nd floor. No one from IT ever did. So when security escorted him into a boardroom full of executives, he knew this wasn't about a server crash. Alexis Sterling, the billionaire CEO who built her empire on sacrifice, sat at the head of the table. "You leave at 5 every day," she said. "You refuse overtime. You prioritize your son over this company." She slid a termination letter forward. "You're fired." Ethan looked at her, and instead of begging, he said something that made everyone in that room stop breathing. 3 hours before Ethan Rivers found himself in that boardroom, his morning had started the same way it always did. At 6:15, he woke to the sound of small feet padding across the hallway. Lucas appeared at his bedroom door, clutching a stuffed dinosaur that had seen better days. "Dad, is it pancake day?" the boy asked. Ethan smiled and pulled back the covers. Every Saturday was pancake day, but today was Tuesday, and Tuesdays meant scrambled eggs and a rushed goodbye at the school gate. Sterling Enterprises occupied a glass tower in the heart of downtown, 47 floors of ambition and exhaustion. The company had made Alexis Sterling a billionaire by 32, and she ran it with the precision of a surgeon and the warmth of a glacier. Employees joked that the building had no clocks because time belonged to Sterling, not to them. Lunch breaks were 15 minutes. Emails sent at midnight expected replies by 1. The parking garage filled before dawn and emptied long after dark. This was not a workplace. It was a proving ground, and only the devoted survived. Ethan had worked in IT for 4 years, long enough to understand the unwritten rules. He knew that promotions went to those who sacrificed weekends. He knew that family emergency was code for career suicide. He knew that Alexis Sterling had never taken a vacation, never mentioned a husband, never been seen leaving before 9 at night. She was the standard everyone measured themselves against, and most fell short. But Ethan had stopped trying to measure up 2 years ago, when his wife left, and he became the only parent Lucas had. His desk sat on the 12th floor, surrounded by servers and blinking lights. He was good at his job, efficient and reliable. He solved problems faster than most, stayed focused, and never complained. But at 5 o'clock every day, he shut down his computer and walked out the door. His coworkers watched him leave with a mixture of envy and disbelief. Some whispered that he had a death wish. Others assumed he had family money and didn't need the job. The truth was simpler. Lucas had soccer practice on Mondays, piano lessons on Wednesdays, and a bedtime story every single night. These were appointments Ethan refused to miss. The call came at 2:17 in the afternoon. Ethan was troubleshooting a network issue when his desk phone rang. The voice on the other end belonged to someone from the executive floor, a floor he had never visited. "Mr. Rivers, your presence is required in conference room A on 42, immediately." The line went dead before he could ask why. His supervisor, a nervous man named Greg, who survived on coffee and anxiety, appeared at his cubicle within seconds. Greg's face was pale. "What did you do?" he asked. Ethan had no answer because he had done nothing wrong. At least, nothing he considered wrong. The elevator ride to 42 felt longer than it should have. Ethan watched the numbers climb and tried to keep his breathing steady. He thought about Lucas, about the permission slip he needed to sign for the field trip, about the dinosaur project due next week. He thought about how his son's face lit up every afternoon when Ethan appeared at the school gate. Always on time, always there. Whatever waited for him in that conference room, he would face it the same way he faced everything else, with his priorities clear. The doors opened to a hallway lined with portraits of Alexis Sterling shaking hands with senators and celebrities. At the end stood 2 glass doors, and beyond them, a long table surrounded by people in expensive suits. Ethan recognized the chief operating officer, the head of human resources, and 2 lawyers whose names he didn't know. At the head of the table sat Alexis Sterling herself. She was younger than he expected, with sharp features and eyes that seemed to evaluate everything they touched. She did not smile when he entered. No one did. "Sit down, Mr. Rivers." Her voice was calm, almost clinical. Ethan took the only empty chair, positioned at the opposite end of the table like a defendant facing a jury. The HR director slid a folder toward him, but Alexis spoke before he could open it. "Do you know why you're here?" Ethan shook his head. He genuinely didn't. His performance reviews were solid. He had never missed a deadline, never caused a security breach, never given anyone a reason to complain. Alexis leaned forward slightly. "You've been with this company for 4 years. In that time, you have never once stayed past 5. You have declined every request for weekend work. You have used all of your permitted sick days, most of them for what you call family obligations." She said the last 2 words as if they tasted bitter. Do you understand what kind of message that sends? Ethan felt the weight of every gaze in the room pressing down on him. He understood exactly what kind of message it sent. He just didn't agree that it was the wrong one. "I complete all my assigned tasks," he said. "My work speaks for itself." The COO let out a small, dismissive laugh. "Your work is adequate, Mr. Rivers, but adequacy is not what built this company. Sacrifice built this company. Commitment built this company. And you have demonstrated neither." The HR director finally spoke, her tone rehearsed and detached. "We've conducted a review of your employment history, and we've determined that your values are not aligned with Sterling Enterprises' culture. You prioritize personal time over professional growth. You refuse to demonstrate the level of dedication we expect from our team members." She slid another document across the table. "This is a formal notice of termination, effective immediately." Ethan stared at the paper, but didn't touch it. 4 years of reliable work, thousands of problems solved, countless systems kept running, and it all came down to this. He went home to his son. He didn't work weekends. He didn't answer emails at midnight. In the world of Sterling Enterprises, that made him disposable. Alexis watched him with an expression he couldn't quite read. It wasn't anger or satisfaction. It was something closer to curiosity, as if she was waiting to see what kind of animal he would become when cornered. Most people begged. She had seen it dozens of times. The desperate scramble to keep a paycheck, the promises to change, the sudden willingness to abandon everything they once claimed to value. She expected Ethan to do the same. But Ethan was thinking about Lucas. He was thinking about the health insurance that covered his son's asthma medication, the savings account that was barely enough for 3 months of rent, the job market that would not be kind to a single father with a gap in his resume. He was thinking about all the ways this moment could destroy the fragile stability he had built. And then he was thinking about the kind of man he wanted his son to see when he looked at his father. He looked directly at Alexis Sterling, not with defiance or desperation, but with something she hadn't encountered in years. Genuine calm. "You're firing me because I'm a good father," he said. It wasn't a question. The room shifted uncomfortably. The lawyers exchanged glances. The COO's smirk faded. Alexis remained motionless, her eyes locked on his. "I'm firing you because you lack commitment," she corrected. Ethan shook his head slowly. "No, you're firing me because I have commitment, just not to you." He stood up, leaving the termination letter untouched on the table. "I know my value, Ms. Sterling. I know what I'm good at, and I know what matters to me. My son will remember that I was there for him. He'll remember that I chose him over a corner office and a bigger paycheck. That's the legacy I'm building." He turned toward the door, then stopped. When he looked back at Alexis, his expression had changed. It wasn't anger. It wasn't even sadness. It was something closer to compassion, and it unsettled her more than any insult could have. "I feel sorry for you," he said quietly. "You have everything anyone could want. Money, power, success. But you're sitting in this room on a Tuesday afternoon, surrounded by people who are afraid of you, firing a man for loving his child. And I think, deep down, you know how empty that is." The words landed like stones in still water. No one moved. No one spoke. Alexis Sterling, who had built an empire on certainty and control, found herself without a response. Ethan walked out of the conference room, into the elevator, and out of the building. He didn't look back. Behind him, in a room full of executives and lawyers, a billionaire sat frozen in her chair, confronted for the first time in years with a question she couldn't answer. What was all of this actually for? The afternoon sun hit Ethan's face as he stepped out of Sterling Enterprises for the last time. He stood on the sidewalk for a moment, watching people rush past him on their way to meetings and deadlines, and all the things that had seemed so important an hour ago. His hands were steady, his mind was clear. But somewhere beneath the calm surface, a clock had started ticking. He had 3 months of savings, maybe 4 if he stretched it. Lucas's asthma medication cost $200 a month without insurance. The rent was due in 2 weeks. These numbers ran through his head like a quiet drumbeat as he walked toward the parking garage. He sat in his car for a long time before starting the engine. The termination letter was still on that conference room table, unsigned and untouched. But it didn't matter. The decision had been made. His employee badge would stop working by morning, his email already locked, his 4 years reduced to a cardboard box that someone from HR would ship to his apartment. He thought about calling his mother, about updating his resume, about all the practical steps that unemployed people were supposed to take. Instead, he looked at the clock on the dashboard. It was 3:45. If he left now, he would still make it to Lucas's school on time. The pickup line at Riverside Elementary was the same as always, a parade of minivans and tired parents checking their phones. Ethan pulled into his usual spot and waited. When the bell rang and children poured out of the building, he spotted Lucas immediately. The mop of brown hair, the oversized backpack, the gap-toothed smile that appeared the moment their eyes met. Lucas ran to the car and climbed into the back seat, already talking about the volcano project his class had started and how his friend Danny had gotten in trouble for eating glue. Ethan listened to every word. He laughed at the right moments. He asked follow-up questions, and he said nothing about the fact that their entire life had just been turned upside down. That night, after dinosaur chicken nuggets and a chapter of their current bedtime book, Ethan sat on the edge of Lucas's bed and watched his son drift toward sleep. The boy's breathing grew slow and even, his small hand still clutching the worn, stuffed dinosaur. Ethan stayed there longer than usual, memorizing the details. The curve of Lucas's cheek, the way his eyelashes rested against his skin, the complete trust in his relaxed features. This was what he had chosen. This was what he had protected. He would not let himself regret it, even as the weight of uncertainty pressed down on his chest. The job search began the next morning. Ethan updated his resume, reached out to former colleagues, and submitted applications to every IT position within reasonable driving distance. He was qualified, experienced, and available immediately, but the market was competitive, and most postings received hundreds of applicants. Days passed without callbacks, then a week. He began to expand his search, applying to companies farther away, accepting that he might face a longer commute. He cut unnecessary expenses, the streaming services Lucas barely used, the gym membership he never had time for anyway, the small luxuries that added up faster than he had realized. Every dollar mattered now. 2 weeks after his termination, a bill arrived from Lucas's pediatrician. The inhaler prescription had been filled just before his insurance ended, but the next refill would cost full price. Ethan stared at the number on the paper and did the math in his head. If he found a job within the next month, they would be fine. If he didn't, he would have to start making choices he had never wanted to make. He folded the bill carefully, placed it in a drawer with the others, and went to make Lucas breakfast. The hardest part was not the financial pressure. The hardest part was pretending that everything was normal. Lucas was 6 years old, too young to understand layoffs and health insurance, and the fragile architecture of adult stability. But children notice more than adults give them credit for. And one evening, while Ethan was cooking dinner, Lucas looked up from his coloring book and asked a question that stopped him cold. "Dad, Why are you home so much now?" Ethan turned off the stove and sat down across from his son. He had known this conversation was coming, had rehearsed it in his head a dozen times, but the words still felt heavy on his tongue. "I'm not working at my old job anymore," he said. "So I'm spending more time looking for a new one." Lucas considered this with the seriousness that only a 6-year-old could muster. "Did you get in trouble?" Ethan almost smiled. "No, buddy. Sometimes jobs just end. It doesn't mean anyone did anything wrong." Lucas nodded slowly, processing this new information. Then his face brightened. "So, you can pick me up from school every day now?" The innocence of the question broke something open in Ethan's chest. "Yeah," he said, his voice steady despite the emotion rising in his throat. "I can pick you up every day." Lucas grinned and went back to his coloring, satisfied with this explanation. He had no idea how close they were to the edge. Ethan intended to keep it that way. Meanwhile, 42 floors above the city, Alexis Sterling was experiencing something she hadn't felt in years. Doubt. She sat in her office long after everyone else had gone home, staring at the city lights below without really seeing them. Ethan Rivers had been gone for 2 weeks, his position already filled by a young man who answered emails at midnight and thanked her for the opportunity to work weekends. The replacement was eager, hungry, and completely forgettable. But Alexis couldn't stop thinking about the man who had walked out of her conference room without looking back. She told herself it was irritation. No one had ever spoken to her that way, certainly not an IT technician with no power and nothing to lose. He should have begged. He should have negotiated. He should have done what everyone else did when faced with the machinery of Sterling Enterprises: bend or break. Instead, he had looked at her with something that felt like pity, and that look had burrowed under her skin like a splinter she couldn't remove. "I feel sorry for you." The words echoed in her mind during meetings, during conference calls, during the rare moments when she allowed herself to stop moving. She had built an empire. She had graced magazine covers and spoken at conferences attended by thousands. She had more money than she could spend in 10 lifetimes. And a man who made a fraction of her salary, who would struggle to pay his rent next month, had looked at her and seen something pitiable. The worst part was that she couldn't entirely disagree with him. Alexis had not taken a day off in 7 years. She had not visited her mother's grave since the funeral. She had not spoken to her sister in over a decade, their last conversation ending in accusations and slammed doors. She had sacrificed everything on the altar of success, and she had always believed the sacrifice was worth it. But sitting alone in her office at 11 at night, surrounded by awards and accolades that suddenly seemed meaningless, she wondered for the first time if she had made a terrible mistake. Back in his small apartment, Ethan was facing his own reckoning. The savings account was shrinking faster than he had anticipated. A pipe had burst in the bathroom, requiring a repair he couldn't afford to postpone. Lucas needed new shoes because his feet had grown again, as children's feet always did at the worst possible times. The job applications kept going out, but the rejections kept coming back, polite and impersonal and devastating in their efficiency. He was overqualified for some positions, underqualified for others, and competing against thousands of desperate people in an economy that had no room for all of them. One night, after Lucas was asleep, Ethan sat at the kitchen table and allowed himself to feel the full weight of his situation. He had done the right thing. He still believed that. But the right thing had a cost, and the cost was measured in sleepless nights and mounting bills and the constant, gnawing fear that he had destroyed his son's stability for the sake of his own principles. He had stood up to a billionaire and walked away with his dignity intact. But dignity didn't pay for medication. Dignity didn't keep the lights on. Dignity didn't guarantee that Lucas would have a roof over his head next month. He looked around the apartment, at the second-hand furniture and the refrigerator covered in Lucas's drawings and the small life they had built together. It wasn't much, but it was theirs. And now it was all at risk because he had refused to be the kind of man who abandoned his son for a company that didn't care if he lived or died. The irony was not lost on him. By choosing to be present for Lucas, he might have guaranteed that he would lose the ability to provide for him. The phone sat silent on the table. No callbacks, no interviews, no lifelines. Ethan had always believed that doing the right thing would eventually be rewarded, that the universe had some kind of balance built into it. But the universe didn't seem to be paying attention. He was 42 years old, unemployed, nearly broke, and running out of options. The man who had walked out of Sterling Enterprises with his head held high was starting to wonder if pride was a luxury he could no longer afford. 3 weeks after his termination, Ethan received an email that stopped his heart. The subject line contained only 2 words: Sterling Enterprises. His first thought was that it must be some kind of mistake, perhaps a glitch in their system that had sent him a company newsletter or a survey. But when he opened the message, he found something else entirely. The email was brief, formal, and unsigned. It requested his presence at the Sterling Enterprises headquarters the following morning at 9 o'clock. No explanation was offered. No context was provided. Just an address he already knew, and a time that gave him less than 12 hours to wonder what was waiting for him. Ethan read the email 3 times, looking for clues that weren't there. He considered not going. Whatever Alexis Sterling wanted from him, it couldn't be good. She had already taken his job, his insurance, his financial security. What else was there to take? But curiosity won out over caution, and something else too. The faint, irrational hope that maybe, just maybe, this nightmare was about to end. He marked the email as read and went to check on Lucas. Tomorrow would come soon enough. Tonight, he would be a father. The elevator doors opened to the 42nd floor, and Ethan stepped out into the same hallway he had walked 3 weeks ago. The portraits of Alexis Sterling still lined the walls. The glass doors of Conference Room A still waited at the end. But something felt different this time. The air was quieter, the usual buzz of corporate urgency replaced by an almost eerie stillness. A young assistant met him at the elevator and led him not to the conference room, but to a private office he had never seen before. The nameplate on the door read, Alexis Sterling, CEO. She was waiting for him inside, alone. The office was larger than his entire apartment, with floor-to-ceiling windows that overlooked the city. Alexis sat behind a desk that probably cost more than his car, but she wasn't looking at spreadsheets or emails. She was looking at him with an expression he couldn't quite identify. It wasn't the cold evaluation he remembered from the boardroom. It was something more complicated, something that might have been vulnerability if he didn't know better. She gestured to a chair across from her desk. "Please sit down, Mr. Rivers." Ethan sat, but he didn't relax. He had spent 3 weeks wondering why she had summoned him back, running through every possible scenario in his mind. Maybe she wanted him to sign something. Maybe there was a legal issue with his termination. Maybe she simply wanted to remind him of her power one last time before he disappeared from her world forever. What he did not expect was what came next. Alexis folded her hands on the desk and looked at him directly. "Your termination was a test," she said. The words hung in the air between them, sharp and incomprehensible. Ethan waited for her to continue, certain he had misheard, but her expression confirmed that he hadn't. "I wanted to see what you would do when everything was taken away. Whether you would beg, negotiate, threaten legal action. Whether you would compromise your values to save your job." She leaned back slightly. "You did none of those things." The revelation should have made him angry. 3 weeks of sleepless nights, of mounting bills and rejected applications, of watching his savings drain away while his son asked innocent questions about why Daddy was home so much. All of it had been orchestrated by the woman sitting across from him, a test designed to measure something she could have simply asked about. But anger required energy, and Ethan had spent the last 3 weeks learning to conserve every resource he had. Instead of rage, he felt only a bone-deep weariness and something else. the need to understand. "Why?" he asked. It was the only word that seemed adequate. Alexis was silent for a long moment, and when she spoke again, her voice had lost some of its corporate polish. "Because you said something to me that no one has said in 15 years. You looked at everything I've built, everything I've accomplished, and you felt sorry for me." She turned her chair slightly, gazing out at the city below. "I've been trying to prove you wrong ever since, and I can't." She told him about her mother, who had died while Alexis was closing a deal in Tokyo. She told him about the phone call she had ignored because the contract was more important, and how she had arrived at the hospital 6 hours too late. She told him about her sister, who had stopped speaking to her after the funeral, who had said that Alexis had chosen money over family and would die alone with nothing but her empire to keep her company. For 15 years, Alexis had told herself that her sister was wrong, that the sacrifices were necessary, that success required a price, and she was willing to pay it. But Ethan's words in that conference room had cracked something open, and she hadn't been able to seal it shut again. "I built this company on the belief that dedication means sacrifice," she continued, "that personal life is a distraction, that the only way to succeed is to give everything to your work and expect the same from everyone around you." She turned back to face him. "You showed me that I was wrong, not because you argued with me, but because you walked away. You chose your son over your career, and you weren't afraid. You weren't broken. You were the most certain person I've ever seen." Ethan listened without interrupting. He understood now why he was here, but he didn't yet know what she wanted from him. The answer came moments later, when Alexis slid a document across the desk. It was an employment contract, but not like any he had seen before. The salary was nearly triple what he had earned in IT. The title was Senior Advisor, Corporate Culture. The responsibilities included reviewing company policies, recommending changes, and reporting directly to the CEO. "I want you to come back," Alexis said. "Not to fix servers, to fix this company." She gestured at the walls around her, at the empire she had built on broken backs and burned-out employees. "I don't know how to do it myself. I've spent my whole life believing that the way I work is the only way to succeed. But you know something I don't. You know how to be successful and still be human." Ethan looked at the contract but didn't pick it up. His mind was racing through the implications. The money would solve everything. The rent, the medication, the creeping fear that had kept him awake for 3 weeks. He could give Lucas stability again. He could stop counting every dollar. He could breathe. But he also remembered the conference room, the faces of the executives who had watched him be terminated without a flicker of discomfort. He remembered the culture that had made his leaving at 5 o'clock into a fireable offense. Money wasn't enough to make him forget. "I have conditions," he said. Alexis nodded, as if she had expected nothing less. Ethan leaned forward, meeting her eyes with the same calm intensity he had shown in the boardroom 3 weeks ago. "First, no more tests. What you did to me was cruel, and it could have destroyed my family. If you want to know what kind of person someone is, ask them. Don't manipulate them into crisis, and watch what happens." Alexis accepted this without argument. Ethan continued. "Second, the company implements real work-life boundaries. Not suggestions, not guidelines that get ignored when deadlines approach. Actual policies that protect employees' time outside of work. No emails after 7. No mandatory weekends. No penalizing people for using their sick days or leaving at a reasonable hour." He could see resistance flickering in her eyes, the old instincts pushing back against everything he was saying, but she didn't interrupt. "Third," Ethan said, "you lead by example. If you want your employees to have balanced lives, you have to show them it's possible. That means you take vacations. You leave the office before midnight. You stop treating exhaustion as a badge of honor." He sat back in his chair. "Those are my conditions. If you can't meet them, I'll find another job. It might take longer, and it might pay less, but I won't help you build a better cage for your employees to die in." The silence stretched between them. Ethan could see Alexis processing his words, weighing them against 15 years of habit and belief. He had no idea which way she would decide, but he had learned something important in the past 3 weeks. He could survive either outcome. He had already lost everything once and kept going. He wasn't afraid anymore. Alexis picked up a pen, made 3 notes on the contract, and slid it back across the desk. The notes confirmed each of his conditions in her own handwriting. "I accept," she said. "All of it." She extended her hand across the desk. "Welcome back to Sterling Enterprises, Mr. Rivers. I look forward to learning from you." 2 years later, Sterling Enterprises was almost unrecognizable. The company that had once been synonymous with burnout and brutal competition had become a case study in corporate transformation. Flexible schedules replaced mandatory overtime. Mental health resources were offered to every employee. The turnover rate dropped by 40%, while productivity increased by nearly the same margin. Business magazines wrote articles about the Sterling Revolution, and Alexis found herself giving speeches about sustainable success instead of relentless sacrifice. Ethan's office was on the 35th floor now, a corner room with windows that caught the afternoon sun. His title had changed twice as his responsibilities expanded, but the most important thing hadn't changed at all. Every day at 5 o'clock, he shut down his computer, walked out of the building, and drove to Riverside Elementary. Lucas was 8 now, too old for dinosaur chicken nuggets, but still young enough to run toward his father's car with a smile that made everything else disappear. On the wall of Ethan's office hung a framed photograph. It showed Lucas at his 7th birthday party, cake frosting smeared across his face, laughing at something his father had said. Visitors sometimes asked about it, and Ethan always gave the same answer. "That's why I'm here. Not the salary, not the title, not the corner office or the corporate transformation or the magazine articles. Just a boy with frosting on his face, and a father who had chosen to be there for the moment." Alexis Sterling kept a similar photograph in her office now. It showed her standing next to her sister at a restaurant, the first meal they had shared in over a decade. The reconciliation had been slow and painful, full of old wounds and difficult conversations. But it had happened because Alexis had finally learned what Ethan had tried to teach her in that conference room. Success without connection is just loneliness with better furniture. The story of Ethan Rivers became something of a legend at Sterling Enterprises, passed down to new employees as proof that the company's values were real. They told it in break rooms and orientation sessions, the tale of the IT technician who told a billionaire she was wrong and changed everything. But Ethan never thought of it that way. He hadn't set out to change a company or reform a CEO. He had simply refused to become someone his son would be ashamed of. Everything else had followed from that single decision. Some nights, after Lucas was asleep and the apartment was quiet, Ethan would sit at the kitchen table and think about the strange path his life had taken. He had been fired, tested, broken down, and rebuilt. He had faced the loss of everything and discovered that the things that mattered most couldn't be taken away. He had learned that courage wasn't the absence of fear, but the refusal to let fear make his choices for him. And he had proven, to himself and to everyone watching, that doing the right thing was never the wrong decision, even when it cost everything. The termination letter from 3 years ago was still in a drawer somewhere, unsigned and forgotten. Ethan had never gone back to collect it. He didn't need a piece of paper to remind him of the day his life changed. He had something better. A son who knew his father would always be there, a company that treated its people like human beings, and the quiet knowledge that he had stood up for what he believed in when it mattered most. That was worth more than any document could ever capture.